let's talk for a second about the left's moves on multiculturalism, which seem to me to have some ties to anti-Semitism in Europe. I mean, having visited Europe, the making room for folks who really despise Jews, and by this I mean some radical Muslim immigrants who have been unvetted, the radical rise in hate crimes against Jews in places ranging from France to Sweden, which in many cases is linked undeniably to a rise in an unvetted population of radical Muslims coming from a part of the world where Jews are particularly hated. Does that have any linkage with the Labour Party's move on anti-Semitism?
Well,
are these unrelated?
It's a really interesting question. I think that the left in Britain and in the US and in Europe has now got itself into this strange obsession with a brand of identity politics that is really about imagined hierarchies of privilege or imagined pyramids of oppression or whatever you want to call it. And it's an incredibly kind of pre-Enlightenment way of seeing the world, that you are defined by the by the caste or the race that you're born with, you know, and you know, you guys in some ways are ahead of anywhere else on this, but our Labour Party has got into it, and so it has good categories and bad categories, and generally, if you're an immigrant, you're in a good category. What's happened and why the door has been opened to anti-Semitism on the left is that in this imagined hierarchy of oppression, the left can no longer tell itself that Jews are an oppressed, you know, discriminated against, wretched minority that suffers from penal laws and all the rest of it. The success of the State of Israel and the success of Jewish people throughout the English-speaking world in particular makes it difficult to maintain this imagined pyramid in your mind. And so with the sticking up for the little guy thing, as they would see it, suddenly Jews have found themselves on the wrong side of the imagined pyramid. And I think it's probably, that's the linkage, if you like. It's the beginning of this re-emergence of racial identity politics.
So do you think that it's left-wing anti-Semitism that is leading to the left's hatred of Israel, or do you think it's vice versa, or do they feed each other? Because one of the things that is obviously notable about Europe is the entire European attitude toward Israel, which is extraordinarily hateful and terrible overall. There are some exceptions, but it seems like there's pretty broad agreement that Israel is the bad guy across Europe. Where is that coming from?
Look, first of all, every country sometimes deserves criticism. Yours does, mine does, Israel does, right? So I'm not saying that you should never criticize Israel or any other country. But you're right, there is a disproportionate focus on a pretty tiny strip of land, which, compared to its neighbors, is doing pretty well. You'd have thought in terms of human rights, democracy, you know, inclusiveness, etc. Where does that come from? You know, a lot of American friends and a lot of Israeli friends of mine say it's anti-Semitism or it's anti-Americanism, and there's an element of truth in that. But I think the bigger factor is this. The European ideal is based on the premise that national loyalties are arbitrary, transient, and ultimately discreditable. That the nation-state is a bad thing. That nationalism causes war and ethnic conflict and all the rest of it. And that, you know, we should all be transcending the nation-state and forming these big supranational unions. That's the EU story in a nutshell. Now, there is no stronger rebuke of that ideology than the story of Israel. Here is a people who are, for 2,000 years, stateless and scattered, but who never lose the aspiration of nationhood. Next year in Jerusalem, right? And then one day, against all the odds, providentially you might say, they achieve it. Now, I look at that story. Most American, you know, politicians look at that story and say, oh, that's a great uplifting story. You know, how fantastic, a triumph against all the odds. But if your starting point is that the national principle is the root of all evil, then you're bound to be triggered by it. And ultimately, I think that's why Israel is always going to fight to get a fair hearing in Brussels. It's because simply by existing, it undermines the whole basis of the European project.